All right, everyone, welcome back. Shifting gears here, we are on to the Katznelson textbook, The Politics of Power, which I've included as a supplement to the Barber book and supplied you with all the PDFs you'll need. Um, I'm sure you've noticed, hopefully you've noticed by now, that this book is obviously more critical in scope than the Barber book. Barber, while she can be critical of the U.S. government and how it operates, maybe not operates to plan, Katznelson's whole approach is definitely much more critical and arguably a bit more serious. I mean, this is a more traditional textbook. There aren't little, in a nutshell blurbs throughout. It looks more like a book for grown-ups than the Barber book. And so you probably found it a bit more challenging to read, but hopefully you found it a bit more rewarding as well. And I do think that reading Barber first um, helps you to understand the Katznelson because there's obviously overlap, and there's some things discussed in the Katznelson first chapter that we're going to come back to in the next section after exam one anyway, conceptually. But it won't hurt you. It actually might help you remember a lot of what I'm asking you to digest here. So the text opens, as you know. Hopefully, you've at least skimmed the reading. But if you looked even at the first couple of pages, you'll see that Katznelson opens with a discussion of the Titanic and using the Titanic as a metaphor, the voyage and crash, as a metaphor for the United States government, right? To ask the question, does American democracy work? Right. Well, the point he tries to make at the outset here is that class and wealth really determines how you start and how you finish. Right. Everything from how the people on the Titanic in the first class of the ship were more likely to survive than people in the third class, and how that equates to real life in contemporary U.S. politics. Right. That your wealth really determines a lot of things like what education you're going to end up with, how long you live, right? And he states matter of factly, or they, it's Ira Katznelson and two other folks who wrote the book, stated pretty matter of factly that the Titanic was designed with not enough lifeboats, and that contributed to a lot of needless death, right? And they go on to claim that we could argue that there really is not enough lifeboat. There are not enough lifeboats in the U.S. political system today, right? That there are inequalities that are persistent throughout the United States today that go beyond class, that include race and gender, which are two issues discussed in the text. Race being the issue in the film 13th that you should have already watched by now, right? And the fact of the matter is that the welfare state, the support that the state provides us in this country, is increasingly smaller, right? So we can see similarities there. But the Titanic, as Katznelson then points out, was not a democracy, right? So while we can consider the metaphor initially, it doesn't hold water, if you'll pardon the pun, in that the Titanic is, again, not a democracy. The captain was not an elected leader of the passengers, right? The captain was responsible to investors, not to the passengers. And ultimately, as is the theme, more so in the next chapter of the textbook of the Katznelson book, as we'll read, business puts profit before patriotism, right? Companies, despite what they'll tell you occasionally in an advertisement, are not patriotic, right? By definition, their goal is to maximize profit, which has nothing to do with patriotism or anything of the sort, right? So after this introduction in talking about the Titanic and parallels to the United States, Katznelson does give us some positives of democracy in the United States. It reads pretty well, this textbook. I think it's a good historical overview, and again, in more adult terms than the Barber book. But the authors point out that suffrage or the right to vote has expanded over time. This is a positive of democracy. This was not without great struggle and strife. But most adults today, 18 and over, are free to vote should they choose, right? To participate fully in the political system in the United States, right? Public authorities are accessible, which, if you have any experience abroad, maybe more so as a grown up, but I mean, I've lived in several places, several countries, and people find it fascinating that in the United States, I can send an email to my senators or my member of the House and expect a response, right? That's a real positive of democracy in the United States. Rule is not arbitrary or unaccountable, and I say in parentheses there, which should definitely be in the back of your mind after watching the 13th documentary, right? I mean, the fact that 30% of African American males in the state of Alabama cannot vote. Because they're convicted felons, and because you know black males do not make up 30% of the population of Alabama, might be an indicator that rule is a bit arbitrary or unaccountable, right? Debate is generally not restricted in the United States. This is a positive, right? I mean, we can say more or less what we want in class without fear of being arrested by the thought police or anything. Democracy has grown over time, and again, to my earlier point on suffrage, this is not without great struggle and sacrifice. And the United States, to an extent, maybe less so in recent years, has become or eventually became a global beacon, right? Numerous political systems replicate the U.S. Constitution. Migrants continue to come to the United States. There are reasons why this is the case. As critical as Katznelson or anybody else might be of the United States, for all its flaws, it still is a magnet for people and an exporter of ideas, right? Which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, that's a reason to be proud of the United States, right? So Katznelson then changes back into more traditional text here, and I'm going to go over this pretty quickly because we've talked about this in regards to the Barber book, and we're going to talk in greater detail about the branches of government and such after exam 1. But we know that the Articles of Confederation was made up the first constitution of the United States, and it failed for reasons we've already discussed, right? States had too much power, really. States could mint their own currency, had their own militias, could formulate their own foreign policies. So Delaware, with however many people had at the time in the late 1700s, was not that much. Decided its own currency, its own militia, and its own trade policy, with France and England and such, right? So it made it really difficult to negotiate the diverse interests of the states. But granted, the Articles of Confederation were designed that way. They were designed to make decision making very difficult, very, very difficult, and it was, and that's why the failure of the Articles resulted in a second attempt at a constitution, which led to the constitution we use now, which is the Constitution of 1787, right? Why has this constitution been successful? Again, for things we've already touched on, but won't hurt us to revisit, especially as you've got an exam coming up. Separation of powers, right? A lack of concentration of powers without the structural hurdles of the Articles of Confederation. So, the branches are separate, but they have checks and balances on each other and are meant to work together, right? By keeping an eye on each other, right? And add to this the notion of federalism, which, again, is a reconciliation of the interests between Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Those who thought that the central government should have more power, those are the Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists who thought that states should have more power. And what the Constitution the current Constitution is, it definitely gives certain powers to the national or federal government and certain powers to the states, right? Ultimately, this is a set of institutions designed to adjudicate among conflicting interests while advocating a public interest, right? The founders designed it designed the Constitution in a way that it would make policy-making, decision-making tricky, not as tricky as the Articles, but ultimately the trickiness is meant to ensure that the public interest is what ultimately is accounted for, right? So going back to the founding, again, these were discussed in the Barber text, but how to determine who governs in the legislature, right? The larger states put forth the Virginia Plan, which provided for a Congress and a House, or a Congress made up of a House and a Senate, both determined by size of population, which again was in the interest of the larger states. New Jersey, which was by population a smaller state at the time. The New Jersey Plan gave more power to the states, and each state would have the same number of representatives in the House and the Senate. And we know that the Connecticut Compromise was agreed to, and this is the legislative system that we have today, which is that the Senate represents states, and each state, regardless of size, geographical size or population, has the same number of senators, 2 per state, and that the House membership is based on population of the state in question. So a very large state like Alaska has very few people, one member of the House. A very large state with lots of people like Texas has 38, I believe, members in the House, and that's set to go up after the 2020 census. So anyway, that's the legislative system we have today. Problem at the time was, of course, the original sin of the United States, which, again, we've talked about already, the question of enslavement and how to determine population. And we know that the Three-Fifths Compromise was yet another compromise reached by the founders, not one to be proud of today, in which enslaved persons counted, in effect, as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining the population and thus the makeup of the House of Representatives for each state, right? And there it was. So regarding the judiciary, of course, the Constitution only provides for a Supreme Court. We know this. And then the whole other court system, which we'll talk about a few weeks down the road, has been created by the Congress with the approval of the president, of course. But we know that the Supreme Court is a thing, right? Its members are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. These are lifetime appointments for all federal judgeships, not just the Supreme Court. The idea is, of course, to remove politics from the bench, but we know that that's not really how things have evolved. But again, we'll talk about this down the road, just giving you the broad basics, broad strokes here at present. The purpose of the Supreme Court was ultimately to resolve constitutional controversies, say by determining when federal or state law applies, to judge how rights are understood and protected, and to settle land and territorial disputes, which really aren't a thing anymore, land and territorial disputes. The president was obviously an important figure for the founders, especially at the Second Constitutional Convention, because unlike the Articles of Confederation, the current Constitution provides for a president, right? There was a recognition that a president was needed for strength to govern, but remind ourselves now that the founders were very leery of creating a position similar to that of a monarch, right? So the Articles didn't provide for a president. The decision was made that, hey, let's create the position, but we're going to restrict what presidents can do, right? Initially, there was no limitation on terms for presidents, but right now, one person can only serve as president for up to 2 4-year terms. This was after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected 4 times. The Constitution was amended to limit the terms for president. But we know that presidents manage foreign affairs. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, oversees the federal bureaucracy, and has the right to veto legislation passed by Congress, right? Checks and balances at their best. The president is also selected by an electoral college, which got quick mention in the text, both Katznelson and Barber thus far. But ultimately, the electoral college is made up of electors, which represent each state, and each state has as many electors as the sum of members of Congress. So again, Alaska, 1 member of the House, 2 senators, 3 votes in the Electoral College. My home state of Kansas, 4 members of the House plus 2 senators, 6 votes. California, the most populous state, after the 2020 census, I believe it goes down to 51 members in the House, plus 2 senators, 53 electors total, right? That's how that works from state to state. Shifting gears from the founding to very much more recent times, we can look at how the Electoral College has changed in recent presidential election cycles. So in 2008, Barack Obama beat John McCain 365 electoral votes to 173. And you can see that Obama surprisingly won states like Indiana, Ohio, North Carolina, so on and so forth, right? Let's jump to 2016, and you can see that Trump, former President Donald Trump, beat candidate Hillary Clinton 306 votes to 232, and Trump regained a lot of ground that Obama had surprisingly won in 2008, like Indiana and North Carolina. But Trump also won in states we call the Rust Belt, where a lot of industry has gone and people have lost jobs in recent generations. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these were real surprises on election night in 2016. But that's how the Electoral College works. That's why I threw in these maps with some updated data just to put into practice what we were just talking about. The 2020 presidential election between then candidate Biden and then President Trump. Same result, 306 to 232, as 2016. And you could see Biden having reclaimed Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, surprisingly won Georgia, and even picked up Arizona, which is a traditionally pretty conservative state. So anyway, point is, the Electoral College is not set in stone. Well, the process is, but the results are not. They can change over time, varies by state to state. But anyway, hopping back into the time machine and going back to the founding here, let's think about the Bill of Rights again, which we've talked about already more than once. Bill of Rights came about in 1791, a few years after ratification of the Constitution in 1783. The Bill of Rights was insisted upon by the Anti-Federalists, as the Constitution lacked an explicit statement of civil rights for individuals, right? So there was a fear of the power of the federal government, because that's really all the Constitution maps out, is the power of the federal government, without stating clearly what rights citizens had. So the 10 amendments, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is what we call the Bill of Rights, spelled out in the First Amendment, which we dissected to some degree last week, maps out freedoms for the individual. Amendments 2 to 4 restrict the executive branch. 5 to 8 restrict the judiciary. Remember, the Fifth Amendment is the right to remain silent in court. You don't have to incriminate yourself. 9 and 10 were very important because these reserved rights to the people and states, 9 to the people, 10 to the states, not explicitly assigned to the federal government in the Constitution, right? So again, that is the Bill of Rights is what made the Anti-Federalists get on board with the Constitution and averted any sort of early constitutional crisis or civil war early after the founding of the country. So it's a great system, huh? That's the end of it. Let's just move on. Not so fast, right? I mean, we can look at a lot of ways in which the United States lags behind many other countries in the developed world, and also countries that maybe we don't necessarily view as so developed when it comes to things like education levels and life expectancy and so on and so forth, right? Infant mortality, maternal mortality, right? Mothers or children dying in childbirth. The United States ranks much higher than even a place like Cuba, which is much poorer than the United States, right? So anyway, I'm not indicting the system, but obviously we should judge democracy not just by its formal procedures, but how these procedures work in practice, right? So think about it, maybe draft up a list. What do you think are things that are important to a democracy and how it functions in practice, right? That's what I would like you to do. That's if we were doing this face to face, that's what we would be doing now. And to Katznelson's greater point here, it is worth stating very matter-of-factly that the founders created a capitalist market economy, right? Nothing wrong with that. We all like our iPhones, and our Coca-Cola and what have you, that we might not have without the innovation and dynamism that capitalism brings to the table. But it is worth asking the question, is this capitalist system within a democracy really democratic, right? This is the theme of chapter 1 of the Katznelson book, and I don't mean to spoil it, give away the ending, but it's really the theme of the entire book. We're not going to read the whole book. We're only going to read a handful of chapters of the Katznelson text, but this is the theme, so keep this in your mind, right? What Katznelson and his co-authors claim is that the system created by the founders has led to what they call a corporate complex, a corporate industrial complex that's really become too big to fail, right? And as evidenced by the 2008 financial crisis, it was a housing crisis, a banking crisis, and all the big banks in the United States at the time of crisis in late 2008 lined up for government handouts, right? The text talks at some length about GM, for example. All three of the major U.S. automakers depended on the government when crisis came. And it was because they were too big to fail, right? Failure of some of the country's largest companies would have massive consequences for normal everyday folks who work for these companies, right? And depend on these products, right? So, is it a problem? Is capitalism a problem? That's not what I'm arguing at all. But we need to consider, again, how democratic a capitalist system within a democracy is, or perhaps should be, right? And does this corporate complex then lead to the views of corporations being unevenly represented in public debate, right? And that's another sub-theme in the Katznelson text here, right? That, yeah, we can talk about things. We have freedom of speech, but this majority rule is confined to a limited range of questions, and that range of questions is often set by those in power, both in political power and economic power, right? That's how that works. So should a democratic system be measured by fair and open elections or by the control and distribution of resources, right? So again, if you had made a list, great. If you didn't make a list of what you think democracy means, maybe hit the pause button and just sketch down a couple of things. Usually people begin with elections, right? First and foremost. Oftentimes we talk about freedom of speech, access to information, right? Freedom to form political parties and interest groups. These are all important things to democracy, but questions that we don't often ask in the United States, which I think we should, and which is why I include this text here, is what should the relationship between capitalism and democracy actually be, right? And I think the Barber text gets at this as well indirectly with some of the figures that are provided in chapter 1. But ultimately, what we're going to talk about throughout the semester here is how should a democracy look or function, right? So maybe you've come up with a list of things, maybe not. Feel free to discuss this in the discussion board, but also keep in mind, keep in the back of your mind, what Katznelson has to say on page 18. And I just flipped open the book right now. I don't often do this, but I'm going to read verbatim to the screen. Katznelson says a successful working democracy requires widespread participation in decision making. Number 2, an absence of restrictions on who gets to participate and on the fair terms of their participation. Number 3, access to relevant and accurate information. Number 4, inclusive representation of the interests, values, and beliefs of citizens. And 5, patterns of decision-making that do not give undue influence to various forms of privilege. And this book, remember, was written way back when in 2014, which is well before we started thinking about some of these questions as seriously as we are now. I think in light of the Summer of Racial Reckoning of 2020. And this book, uses privilege in ways, the word privilege in ways that you didn't hear very often, again, prior to 2020. I'm particularly thinking about white privilege, but Katznelson's talking about various forms of privilege, which obviously includes economic privilege. And his point is, or their point is that, economic privilege is really outsized in the U.S. political system. And that can be dangerous for democracy, is ultimately what Katznelson is wanting us to think about, right? So some key questions to keep in mind. Do the country's representatives reflect the characteristics of those they formally represent, right? Are representatives aware of and responsive to their constituents' concerns? How does a democratic system work amid inequality of resources, right? So think about this, right? I mean, we'll look at data when we get to the chapter in the Barber text on Congress, but Congress is overwhelmingly old, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly trained lawyers, right? I mean, get beyond the race and gender, and we start, the puzzle gets even more complicated in some ways and more direct in others, right? I mean, do we need a Senate that's 2/3 made up of lawyers? Maybe we should have a plumber or two in there. I don't know. Things for you to think about. But maybe policies would be made differently. Maybe we wouldn't have a prison industrial complex like that was dissected in the documentary film 13th if the prison system wasn't shaped by private economic interests. And maybe the people who ultimately make political decisions on the state of affairs in the prison system weren't wealthy white males who were lawyers, right? Things to think about, right? And again, ultimately, how much inequality can a democracy handle, right? And Katznelson's pretty matter of fact on page 20 says here, and I included the text on the slide as you can see, extreme inequality blocks the full achievement of a fully realized democracy in which all citizens have chances to influence the making of decisions that affect them. I don't think that's really hard to disagree with, right? Um, I'm not here to say that we need to remove all inequality from the U.S. political system. That's impossible. That's impossible, right? And it's really impossible in any capitalist system. But it could be that economic inequality is an impediment to the realization of all the exercise of inalienable rights that Thomas Jefferson talked about, that we should have all received from a higher being, a God, in which they are applied and exercised equally, right? It could be that something is getting in the way. Something has gotten in the way in the United States, right? So anyway, chapter 1 here wraps up with a discussion of political change, right? I mean, we're going back and forth from the founding to present day here. But Katznelson does point out that a lot of these issues are really not new. Context maybe has changed. The United States, upon its founding, of course, was not a superpower globally, and that has been a real change over time, particularly after the Cold War. I mean, at the end of World War II, the United States was one of two global superpowers, and after the Cold War, at the tail end of the 20th century, the United States was really the world's only superpower, and a very present superpower with over 700 plus military bases overseas that are recognized in some 28 countries. And spends a lot more spends as much on its military as the next 15 countries combined. Most of those are allies anyway. But the biggest military in the world protects the world's largest economy, as Katznelson states very matter-of-factly. So, as we're thinking about inequality, we're thinking about the economic power of the United States. In this day and age, it's impossible to only think about the United States and not think about the wider world, right? That's why this chapter is mapped out the way it is, right? But again, this combination of military and economic power underpins U.S. influence in international affairs. A question that was perhaps more relevant to when this book was published: has the pursuit of security changed how we live at home? Right? There was real trade-off, particularly is where we've passed the 20 years since 9/11, since September 11, 2001. 20 years ago, this was a real hot debate, right? To what power should the government have that might impede on our freedom, but with the goal of providing us the security that we expect from our government, right? We were really worried collectively 20 years ago that the government was going to overreach. And I don't know that happened. It's really difficult to say. But the reality is, and as the text points out, as the world has become more and more integrated technologically, politically, economically, the role of the United States is arguably even of greater importance, right? But it also makes the United States more vulnerable, arguably, right? And that's evidenced by, again, the attacks on September 11th of 2001, right? But anyway, that's a real change, right? Again, the United States was very weak at the time of its founding, very worried about powers like France and the United Kingdom interfering with domestic affairs within the United States. But anyway, that's where we are now. How about domestically? Katznelson, by discussing the founding and going back to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, we should remind ourselves that polarization is not new in the United States, right? Really, it is not. The country was founded in no small part on political disagreement and compromise. The problem is here, I would argue, and I think what Katznelson is saying in the text, is that moderates in both major parties, right, the Republicans and Democrats, are really an endangered species. And we're seeing extremes in both parties come to prominence, and that impedes compromise, right? I just said the word compromise in reference to the founding. There seemed to be more of it than we're seeing now. And then beyond that, this notion of persistent crisis, whether that's, we can look at really the last several decades, going back to well before you were born, even before Larson was born, believe it or not. But global economic crisis in the early 70s because of oil. Crisis, inflation in the 1980s under Reagan. Economic crisis, the last of George H.W. Bush's first and only term, arguably led to Bill Clinton getting elected in 1992 because of economic crisis. Clinton cyclically was very lucky and didn't have to deal with much economic crisis, but 2001 economic crisis came after the attacks of September 11th, then the housing crisis of 2008, and then, of course, the economic crisis that came along with the coronavirus pandemic of recent years, right, of back to 2020 and beyond. So, this notion of persistent crisis really calls into question the virtues of markets and the promises of government, right? If we obviously can't put our faith in markets because they're too volatile, and government has not come through really to prevent crisis as we would hope. So here we are, right? We're left with a system that on paper looks pretty good, but doesn't entirely keep us out of trouble, right? Is where I'm going with this. So anyway, keep this in mind. The next chapter of Katznelson deals with the more with economic issues, capitalism and democracy specifically. So keep what we've just covered in the back of your mind as we transition into the next chapter. Good luck to you. Be in touch.